Tiffany Marcito. I'm a supervisor for Adult Protective Services for El Paso County DHS. I'm here with Eric Bidwell. He is a manager for El Paso County DHS, and he oversees the Adult Protective Services program, as well as long-term care medical programs and adult financial programs. Eric, I think this is an area of DHS that not a lot of individuals probably know about, specifically Adult Protective Services. Can you tell us about the process of how information makes its way to DHS and how it's handled once it gets there?
Yeah, so we receive reports at DHS through a variety of ways. The reports come through via email, they come through over the phone, and the phone number to contact us is 719-444-5755. And they also come through fax for some professional medical entities. But broadly what happens is the intakes come to us. We take those information that's contained in each of those reports, we write it up into our database, and then every day we review as a group the reports that came in from the prior day. So there's a group of individuals that get together, they take a look at the reports, and they kind of are looking for mainly two things. They're looking to see if there is an allegation that's contained in that information that would fall into one of the criteria that is outlined in statute. And so that could be exploitation, it could be caregiver neglect, a few different categories. Then they're also looking to see if there is an at-risk adult or a suspected at-risk adult contained in that information as well. And that's what kind of they're looking for, reviewing both of those components. If they see that both of those things exist, then they're going to screen that report in and assign it to a caseworker who then is going to go on and make contact with that individual and kind of gather investigative information, provide services, that kind of thing. If there is one or both of those things that don't exist, then that information is screened out and it's just kind of housed in our database for future reference if we need it.
Is that a common approach across the country?
So it's not common in the sense that, so when we're looking for that at-risk adult, how we define that is someone who is not able to obtain services for themselves. So they can't get their basic needs met on their own. But it doesn't specifically say why that may be. And so it could be due to someone that's elderly or has some sort of cognitive impairment. It could be because there's someone who has a intellectual or developmental disability and is relatively young, but they still can't meet their own basic needs. And so Colorado is unique in the sense that it doesn't set a standard age, it doesn't set a standard disability. Rather, it says broadly, if they can't do this for themselves, we should be involved in those cases. And so that is not common across the country. There is often some sort of age threshold or requirement or some other kind of quantifying factor that is in place. But with Colorado, it is if they're able to do this for themselves, then we probably shouldn't be involved. But if they aren't, then we probably should be.
You talked a little bit about the screen out process. What do you do with that information in the future? You said you house it in a database, but what do you do with that?
Yeah. When we screen information out, obviously, as I said, it's because it doesn't meet one or both of those criteria. So either we don't have an at-risk adult that's identified in the report, or we don't have an allegation that falls into one of our categories. But what sometimes happens is a reporter may call on an individual that they have concerns about, and they don't have maybe all of the data, or they don't have all of the facts related to this situation, but they have some and they're kind of concerned about what they do know. We may not be able to screen that in, but maybe a month down the road, someone else makes a report and potentially it fills in some of the gaps that might have existed. And so now when we look at that as a bigger picture, we can see that yes, now we do have an allegation and we do have an at-risk adult, and so that information may end up getting screened in. And so the reason we continue to house that information is we want it from a historical perspective. We can also sometimes track over time that maybe this individual wasn't really displaying characteristics that we would have said that they met at-risk criteria, but as reports continue to come in, maybe now they are. And so it's just a way for us to be able to look at things from a bigger picture and have that whole perspective.
Can you explain the next steps when a case is screened in?
So when a case is screened in, there's a couple different timelines that kind of start that the caseworker that it's assigned to needs to follow. So one of those, for example, is they need to make contact with the person the report is about within 3 days. And that's for non-emergency cases. If it's an emergency case, they have to see them within 24 hours. Those cases don't happen all that often. So primarily they're working on a 3-day timeline. And they're going to go out and make attempts to try and see that individual and start kind of gathering and seeing what may be going on with that person to try and be able to determine if, one, what was reported is actually happening, and two, to provide services to the individual to try and help them with either that or any other need they may have. Then they're going to get to about the 60th day on the case. And this timeline is not, we don't have to have it open 60 days. We may have a situation where the individual maybe doesn't want our assistance or already has kind of what they're needing, and we determine that there really isn't need for us to be involved. But we have up to that timeline to gather as much information as we can and kind of come to a finding on the case where we're essentially saying, here's all the data, all the facts that we were able to gather, and here's what we determined. This either did or didn't happen, and this person that was identified either did or didn't do something to that adult. And then at that point, we're probably going to close the case, although if there are services that need to be put in place, there's an additional step that we can take that kind of helps us work through the process of getting those services implemented.
Can you explain what coordinating with the community partners look like, and what some of the supports for the at-risk clients can be beneficial for the investigation?
Yeah. So we work with a myriad of service providers and community partners, and one of our biggest strengths is being able to have a large amount of community resources that we can put in place on cases at any given time. There are a lot of parts in the state and a lot of places where they just don't have access to the amount of resources that we have. But that's all dependent on our community providers and our partners. And so they have a lot of services that offer that can be things from like working in home and assisting an individual in cleaning their home, or being able to make meals for themselves and all of those kinds of things, as well as something more concrete like maybe they need in-home nursing care for like a wound they have or something of that nature. But really we have a large scale of services that we can put in place, and that's a direct result of the amount of providers that we have that we work with really closely.
So I imagine that there are times when the at-risk individual welcomes services from Adult Protective Services. What do you do with those individuals who are reluctant to services?
Yeah, I think that this is probably one of the most challenging things for the caseworkers that do this every day, because it can be very disheartening over time when you know that you have a service or that you have something that could truly benefit this individual, but they're not willing to accept it and they don't want the help. But we have to keep going back to one of the founding kind of guiding principles of adult protection from the very beginning is that these are adults. They have a right to self-determination. They have a right to choose. And what that means is we can work with them and we can try and get them to understand the benefits of the services that we may have, but ultimately it's their decision and they have a right to live how they want to live. And so this can be really difficult sometimes, both for the caseworkers that are doing it day in and day out, as well as for the community at large to kind of understand why it may seem like adult protection isn't doing something in this particular case, because we're trying maybe, but this individual doesn't want that assistance, and so we can't make them. And really, it kind of goes back to they have the right to make that decision. They don't have to talk to us. They don't have to cooperate with us at all. They don't have to even let us in. Like, it's all based on what they want. And so we try really hard to build that relationship with them from the very beginning to kind of build up a rapport with them so they do feel comfortable working with us.
What would the exceptions be?
So there are exceptions to this, and generally speaking, those exceptions are when we feel that someone may not have the cognitive capacity to understand the implications of their decisions. And so what that means is DHS roughly receives about 3,000 reports every year. Out of that 3,000, about half of them meet the screening criteria to be screened in, which is about 1,500. And then only 1% of those are determined where we are able to say this person does not understand potentially the implications of their decisions or what it is they're choosing. And then we have to potentially go to court and we have to look at guardianship of that individual. But those are the exceptions. They're very, very rare, but they're also often the ones that get the most recognition because it's such an extreme measure that we're taking at that point. Because APS works on the basis of least restrictive. We want to start with the least restrictive that we can, and that's the most restrictive intervention that can possibly happen. And so because of that, it's also the one that gets the most attention, even though it's the very least when it comes to the amount of times it happens.
You mentioned court evaluations and the guardianship process. What is that process for those in the community who may not know the steps to take?
Yeah. So when we identify through the course of a case an individual who we think may be not able to understand potentially all of the decisions that they're making and what the repercussions of those could be, the first step is we try and schedule them what's called a neuropsych exam. And essentially what this does is it's a professional evaluation specifically designed to determine, does someone kind of understand all of the decision making? Are they able to work their bills? Are they able to understand cause and effect? Are they able to understand the things that we often just take for granted? If through the course of that process it's determined that they don't understand that, then we look at, okay, now we may need to file in court to see if we can have some sort of guardian appointed for this person, because that guardian then, after being legally appointed by a magistrate, is a legal decision maker for them for as long as it's required after that. And so it's a super in-depth process. There's multiple steps through that process that we have to kind of navigate, but all of those things are designed to be checks and balances because that's the most extreme response possible through one of our cases.
You touched a little bit on closing a case. When does one know when to close a case and when not to?
So I would say there's a couple different points in a case where a caseworker could recognize and say, okay, this case needs to be closed. One of those is going to be if the person refuses services. We still need to continue our investigation. We still need to gather as much information as we can, but without the participants' involvement, it makes that process extremely challenging. So we may run into dead ends and end up having to close the case. Also, if we run into a situation where the individual doesn't need anything else, we've been able to get those services in place, or we've identified services, but maybe the person has been cooperative but doesn't want that specific service. Ultimately, the easiest way to look at it is when we've finished the investigation process to the best of our ability, we've offered services to the individual, and they've either accepted and those are set up, or they've said they don't want those services. That's at the point at which we're ready to close that case, because we've investigated what it was we were in there to do, and we've offered and provided any services we possibly can to the individual. It's time then to close the case, because we don't do case management long term after those services have been put in place.
So what would make a case stay open for a longer period of time than normal?
Some of it can be down to the timeline of service implementation. So we might say they need this service, but that service in our community is either hard to find, or there's a waiting list, or it takes time to get that service set up. And it could also be because the case needs to go through that court process that we mentioned earlier. That court process can take quite a long time. And if in those situations, rather than being at that 60-day mark, we could be 4 or 5 or 6 months into the process by the time we've gotten it all wrapped up. And so those are typically the reasons that a case would be open a little bit longer than usual.
So we talked a little bit about the process for clients and implementing services and resources for them.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens to the person who harmed the client?
So when we wrap up a case, we make what's called a finding. And essentially that is a culmination of all of the information that we gathered over the course of the case. And we're going to make a decision as to whether the perpetrator substantiated, which means we have preponderance of the evidence to believe that this person did commit the information that was the act and the information that was provided to us. Or unsubstantiated, that they didn't. And then we have one that is essentially inconclusive. We have some information maybe, but it doesn't really rise to that preponderance level. If the information is inconclusive or unsubstantiated, nothing really happens. There's no notification, the case is essentially closed at that point. But if we find that the information was substantiated, we believe and we have the documentation, the data to show that at least preponderance of evidence would indicate that this person did harm this other individual, there's a letter that's going to go out to that perpetrator to let them know that they have been found substantiated as a perpetrator in one of our cases. And then they have a right at that point to appeal that determination at state level. And that's done at state level because it's considered a neutral third party. The individuals that are going to be hearing that appeal and kind of working with the individual through that appeal process had nothing to do with the case. They had no part in the case. They're not even housed in the same building with us. They're housed at state level. So it really gives them an opportunity to kind of look at the case from fresh perspective, hear what the individual has to say, see what was documented in the case, and kind of make a final determination as to whether that finding will stand and remain, or whether it will be changed and what it would be changed to.
So it sounds like that the caseworkers have to follow the Colorado laws and rules when they complete their investigation.
Mm-hmm.
How could you guide community members who may not expect the outcome that they would want if somebody was abused or neglected?
It's a hard one because, when we see from our perspective, so as a reporter in that moment, I'm seeing things that I'm genuinely concerned about, right? And that's the whole reason that I'm prompted to make the report to begin with. But the difficulty with that is, as we're working through that case, we might be getting banking records, we might be getting professional medical records, we might be getting account information, firsthand account information from various parties involved in the case. And so, unfortunately, what can sometimes happen is the individual that made the initial report, they see it from the perspective that they're coming from, right? But they're not necessarily seeing then the whole picture of the information that we've gathered over the course of the case. And where it could look like it was super cut and dry, very simple from their perspective, when we start gathering all of that information, we start realizing there's a lot more going on here, and maybe it's not the way it seemed initially. And that's really tough sometimes. And I certainly can recognize that. At the same time, I think there also needs to be a level of trust that, the process was designed to do this specifically. And as we walk through that process, we're going to gather all the information that we potentially could. And there's some times where people won't cooperate with us, even the client themselves. And so we may not get all of the information we need to be able to create that finding.
So I feel like some of this information can help community professionals and community members better understand the APS process. Do you have any final insights that you want to give us?
Yeah, so I think that in this process, there are a few things that I hear sometimes from individuals that come up as questions that we may be able to answer. So one of those kind of stems from a licensing issue or question. And DHS doesn't investigate licensing of facilities or of professional organizations or entities. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment does that. And so we work very closely with them in partnership to refer information to them, and they refer information to us. But if there is a systemic issue with a facility or an agency, we're very limited in our ability to kind of have any impact on that. And we would refer people to report to CDPHE, as we call it, online or through their website to have their concerns recognized and looked into. The other thing I hear from individuals as family members is, what can we do to help prevent our loved ones from being taken advantage of either in a facility or within their environment? And first I would say that we need to maintain relationships and connections with these individuals. We're going to stand a better chance of knowing when something's happening to them if we are close with them and maintain close contact with them than if we don't. And secondly, if I'm going and I'm working with an individual, my family member, and we know they need to be placed in a facility, or we know that they need an organization to be involved maybe in their own home, I'm going to do some research on that, right? Like, I'm going to go to that facility outside of their normal operating hours to see what things look like, because the unfortunate truth is sometimes things can look polished on the surface, but when you go on off times or you're seeing them, you know, when they're not regularly scheduling tours, you're going to get a better picture as to, is this just surface or is this really how they operate? And then lastly, the CDPHE website also will display each licensed facility, any complaints that they've had, any formal corrections that they've had to have with that facility. All of that will be listed on their website, and that's a great asset for individuals as well.
Thank you so much, Eric, for all of your information on the processes of Adult Protective Services. I really appreciate your time. And thank you for joining us.